Hello and welcome back to Pathway Students Online. And last week we jumped back into our Daniel series called Living with Conviction in a World of Compromise. Today we continue that as we look at Daniel chapter 5. In Daniel 4 last week, it revealed the subtle pride that King Nebuchadnezzar was living with that crept into his heart. He had been forewarned about the danger of that pride, but it was a slow creep. A year after he had been warned about the pride that was going to come before his fall, King Nebuchadnezzar allows that pride into his heart and actually falls. And he takes on the form of an animal, basically. His pride got the better of him, and for 7 years, he was eating grass like an animal. He had the mind of an animal. He was crawling around on all fours like an animal. His hair was growing out like an animal's. His fingernails were going out like an animal. And so here Nebuchadnezzar fell because of his pride. And it was as he looked to heaven, he humbled himself, he submitted himself to the sovereignty of God. It's as he does that he's restored. It's as he does that, he receives again his kingdom back, and he continues to be able to reign and to rule. And he's restored to power, and his kingdom flourishes as he acknowledges that Yahweh, the Lord, is the sovereign power, the sovereign ruler over all. Today, as we enter chapter 5, the grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar, named Belshazzar, is now ruling. And as a grandparent, really your hope is that your kids and your kids' kids would learn from your example. We saw that Nebuchadnezzar learned a lesson the hard way, and we're going to see that Belshazzar, his grandson, did not learn from his grandfather's example. He makes the same kind of mistake, the same kind of prideful decision, but the consequence is going to be different for Belshazzar. He didn't learn the lesson, but continued the cycle and faced a worse and more immediate consequence than Nebuchadnezzar did. One commentator says this about the difference between their pride. He says Nebuchadnezzar showed his pride by boasting about his achievements and taking credit for what God had helped him to accomplish. But his grandson displayed his pride by desecrating the holy vessels from the temple of the Most High God and treating the Lord with contempt. This is a deep-rooted heart issue that we're going to see in Belshazzar, this arrogance that he has as he desecrates the vessels of the Lord Most High. So let's see what happens as we read through Daniel chapter 5, beginning in verses 1 through 4. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles, and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. Now, it's using the term father here to indicate like his successor, the one who came before him. It's actually his grandfather in line, but using this terminology of father and son is the one who was on the throne before him. So the one who succeeded, or was it prior to him, his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So this is quite a transition from Daniel 4, where Nebuchadnezzar is writing in his hand. Now we have King Belshazzar on the throne. Nebuchadnezzar had died in 562 BC, and there was a quick succession of 3 different kings that reigned over a short period of time until King Nabonidus became king from 556 to 539 BC. Belshazzar is likely the grandson, like we mentioned, of Nebuchadnezzar, and Nabonidus ruled the Babylonian Empire, while Belshazzar, his son, his actual son, was co-regent and ruled the city of Babylon as the king. And so in this book of Daniel and Daniel 5, they would have viewed Belshazzar as the king of Babylon. So we come to this banquet in Daniel 5, and why is Belshazzar throwing a banquet? We're going to see at the end of chapter 5 that the Persian Empire has been waiting at the gates, and they're going to come in and actually kill Belshazzar this very day. But what is Belshazzar doing? There's this banquet during a time of war. The Babylonian Empire was at war with the Persian Empire. It was rumored that King Nabonidus had actually just suffered a crushing defeat at the hand of the Persians and had fled. So he was on the run. He's kind of deposed as king. Persia is taken over. But here in the city of Babylon, Babylon is standing firm and standing strong because they have these gigantic walls, these huge gates. I mean, some of these walls were 300 feet tall. That's quite a surmountable or insurmountable obstacle to try to take over this city. So Babylon, this city, was feeling it pretty good about their chances. And so here we most likely have Belshazzar in this coronation ceremony. Belshazzar claiming the victory as his, as he is the king. Nabonidus has fled, so he claims the throne. So he's having this coronation party with 1,000 of the people in his kingdom and proclaiming himself as the new king. One commentator said this about having this banquet in the middle of a war, in the middle of a siege. And he said, why worry about the enemy when you have security and plenty to eat? And that's almost the mentality that Belshazzar seems to have had, because he's in the middle of a siege, and yet they claim that, hey, even though we're in the middle of a siege, we've got the Euphrates River running through Babylon. We've got enough food to last us for a few years within the city walls. We're going to be okay. We're going to outlast them. So he has this arrogance of, hey, why worry about outside the gate when inside the gate we are secure, safe, comfortable, and have plenty to eat? And I have to wonder, in this kind of context for us in America, like in the West, are we so comfortable that we neglect to understand that we are in a war? To realize that we're actually in a spiritual battle every single day of our lives? Are we so secure and filled that we don't realize that we're in a battle? We don't actually see what's going on around us. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12 says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." There's more going on than what we see with our eyes, but we need to have the vision to be able to see it. It means taking our eyes off of what is immediately in front of us and opening our gaze to have a wider vision and a longer term vision to see what's really going on. So now we understand a little bit more about the banquets and what's going on here. Belshazzar is really this arrogant child who's claimed the title of king from his father, even though it's not been given to him, that his father's fled and run away. And he did not learn humility from his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. As Nebuchadnezzar had captured Jerusalem, we read in Daniel 1, he brought many Jews to Babylon and brought along with them a lot of things from the temple. And so we have all these vessels that have been consecrated to the Lord. They've been consecrated to be used for the worship of God in the temple of God. And so Belshazzar took these vessels and had been consecrated for use in worship to Yahweh and used them, as one commentator says, like common drinking cups. And while they were drinking, they praised the false gods of Babylon. Now, there's one thing we see that God cannot stand, and it's when somebody takes what is his and uses it for worship of another god. It's in one of the 10 Commandments to not worship any other gods. And so Belshazzar and those with him were taking the things that had been consecrated for the Lord and using them to worship and praise false gods. So we're going to see what happens next in Daniel chapter 5, verses 5 through 12. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners, and then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. One thing that baffles me is, why is Daniel always the last one to be brought into these situations? He's not even here yet, and no one can interpret these things. It happened with both dreams of Nebuchadnezzar. It's happening here. Why not just go to Daniel first? And I have to wonder, is it because they didn't trust, even though Daniel was filled with the spirits of the holy gods, as they said, did they not trust his God? Did they trust their gods more? And so they're like, hey, we're going to try our own thing first. We're going to go after our own gods first, and then we'll see what happens. It's never worked. Doing things their own way has not worked out for them. So it continues on. The queen, who is actually Nebuchadnezzar's wife. So the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. This is the queen mother. May the king live forever, she said. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, or your grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, to explain riddles and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. So somebody finally remembers that Daniel can interpret these things. They're going to call him in and say, hey, Daniel, can you help us out? This scenario is not going to be a new one for Daniel, but there's a revelation from God, a fearful and frustrated ruler, incompetent counselors, and God's servant comes to the rescue to communicate again the sovereignty of God, to see again how much God cares about humility, how much he values humility. So we continue on in verses 13 to 17. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it says, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Now, this was not written in a foreign language. This was written in the language of the Babylonians. So they should have been able to read it, but no one could give the interpretation. They could see the words, but not understand what was going on and what was being said. They couldn't give the interpretation. So Daniel now is going to go through and remind Belshazzar of what had happened to King Nebuchadnezzar, of how Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, Daniel interpreted it, and how he for 7 years had been wandering around like an animal, eating grass and all that. And he's going to remind him of the value of humility. At the end of verse 21, he says, his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, all these things he did, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. Verse 22, but you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. Daniel again recognizes this challenge between the gods of Babylon and the God of the Bible. He looks at the gods of Babylon and says they can't see or hear or understand. They are lifeless objects of wood and stone and metal. They can do nothing. They can't help you. These false gods that you look to for identity or belonging or whatever it may be, security or safety or blessing or pleasure, none of those things will deliver. And the same goes for us. What false gods or idols do we worship? Do we look to for belonging, for our identity? What do we look to other than the Word of God to tell us what is true? Looking to the Lord to understand how we can experience pleasure and joy through Him and following His plan and His guidance. Nothing and no one compares to Yahweh, the Lord God, the most high God. And Daniel reminds Belshazzar of that. You did not humble yourself, Belshazzar, but you took these things consecrated for the Lord and used them to worship your false gods. It's not going to work out for him. So what happens here? He continues on and says, this is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Paris, or the plural, which is Parsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So the repetition of Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, Mene, Mene, means God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end, and it's going to be immediate because it's repeated. It's going to happen today. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. You have not been a man of character or integrity. You've not been a man of God, Belshazzar. And so your life is going to be required of you. Today, you're going to give an account for your actions. And then Paris, or Parsin, being the plural, is a word talking about Persia and divided. It means a couple different things. And so the kingdom is going to be divided between the Persians and the Medes, and they're going to take over, and it's going to happen that day. So Daniel gives the interpretation, and then verse 29, at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. It would have been Nabonidus, Belshazzar, and Daniel. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. That very night, Belshazzar, king of Babylon, was slain. We don't know when that very night is going to be for us. God is sovereign and you are not. I am not. Belshazzar had short-term vision. He looked what was right in front of him. He saw that his father Nabonidus had fled from Persia, and so he claimed himself as king, not looking to the battle ahead, not looking to win the battle, just looking to ride it out. Belshazzar had a short-term vision. If we're going to live with conviction, it's going to take us long-term vision. It's going to require of us long-term vision. We can live with conviction only as we understand that what we see is not all there is. There's a battle going on all around us, a spiritual battle that we are very much a part of, whether we admit it or not. Again, that Ephesians 6:12 is that our battle is not against flesh and blood. It's not against what is right in front of us. It is a spiritual battle that we are engaged in. And so my prayer is that we would not be so safe and secure and comfortable that we miss out and we misunderstand that we're not in a battle. We think that we're not in a battle. May we see it for what it is. May we have that long-term vision. One day you and I are going to give an account for our actions. We're going to give an account for our careless words. We're going to give an account for what we have done with our lives, who we have believed in. When you go to give an account with Jesus Christ, what are you going to say? Who is the sovereign over your life? Who is in control of your daily living? Who guides you to make the right decisions? Is it you? Or is it the sovereign ruler over all, Yahweh, the Most High God, who has the first and greatest importance in your life? One day you'll give an account. One day I'll give an account. We don't know when that will be. But my prayer is that when you give an account, that you have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, that he would bear your sin debt, that you could be at peace with God and live with him forever. Thanks for tuning in this week, and we'll see you next week as we continue studying through the book of Daniel together.